The first item on the agenda is approval of the July 22nd, 2021 External Relations Committee meeting minutes. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second.
The motion's properly moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, members will please vote. Motion passes. The next item on the agenda is a briefing, 2022 State Legislative Preview. Ms. Kiernan, please.
Good morning, Mr. Ash, Mr. Parker, members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. This is actually going to be an overall political and legislative update. So we'll start, next slide please, with the local election results and overview of runoffs. We'll then do the state legislative preview, and then we'll do a quick federal update. Next slide, please. As you are likely aware, we have a runoff coming up on November 30th, and we have several City of Atlanta posts up, including the mayor, city council president, and city council post 3 at large. We also have 5 district runoffs, which you can see on the map, 1, 3, 4, 5, and 12, mostly on the east and south side of town, except for 3. So we will be watching those closely. It's a mixture of open seats and some incumbents who find themselves in runoff. So we will look forward to making contact with at least some new members of council, as well as watching the District 4 and 12 outcomes. Next slide, please. We also have a number of other mayoral races throughout our jurisdictions, a combination of incumbents and runoffs and just new mayors. So starting, we'll just go around the clock. In Fairburn, the incumbent mayor, Mayor Carr Hurst, is in a runoff. City of South Fulton in a runoff. Roswell will have a new mayor. The incumbent was defeated. Johns Creek was an open election, has a new mayor. Stone Mountain, new mayor, and Forest Park incumbent is in a runoff. So we will continue to watch all of these and welcome our new elected officials and bring them up to speed on all the work that MARTA is doing in their jurisdictions and for their constituents. Thank you, Mayor Floyd. I missed. Thank you. Noted. I will get that corrected. Next slide, please. For a state legislative preview, I just wanted to highlight some of the issues that I think that will be the major issues in this session. We had a MARTA hearing earlier this week where we had the opportunity to talk about an update on the federal situation, what we've done with the COVID relief money, and then our vision for how our economic development syncs in well with the state priorities. Right now, redistricting is going on. The House and the Senate districts have been approved. The Senate will be voting on the congressional districts today. A major issue that we'll be following is the movement towards a referendum to create a new city in Buckhead City. We'll be, again, asking for a transit trust fund appropriation to support our strategy on the east-west line. And we believe that the Speaker and the Governor have identified mental health as a major priority for them this year, and there's been a behavioral health task force of some sort, health commission. In any event, we're working to position ourselves and bring the program that we've been running, the MARTA Hope program, the partnership with Hope Atlanta, to primarily address the unsheltered populations on the system, but mental health issues are intertwined with those, so we want to be a positive contributor to that conversation. Next slide, please. I think we've had this update a number of times, so I'll be brief, but as you know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed by the President earlier this week. The 2 major things to highlight are the increased formula funds that we will be receiving from the Federal Transit Administration, as well as the change to the Small Starts program that Senator Warnock really led the charge on, that will help so many of our capital projects advance and get a larger federal share. Next slide, please. The other things I wanted to highlight are that the Secretary of Transportation will have a pretty Huge pot of discretionary funding, so the RAISE grant and then others. There are a couple of new pots of Federal Highway Administration formula funds, and there's transit eligibility there. We have the earmarks that we will find out about soon, whether they make it through the appropriations process, and then the Build Back Better bill looks to be getting a vote in the House today, and there's another approximately $10 billion for transit and affordable housing in that. Oh, thank you. I was on the train. There were delays. Thank you for the update, Chairman Ash. Next slide. So with that, my update is concluded, and I'm happy to entertain questions or discussion. Thank you. No, there will not be a vote in the special session on the Buckhead City referendum.
Either by this board or by the General Assembly.
It has to go through 2 sessions.
Yeah, but Brandon dropped the bill yesterday, the senator from Forsyth County. The next item on the agenda, Ms. Fisher.
Good morning, Chairman Ash, Vice Chair Scott, Mr. Parker, and committee members. I'm Stephanie Fisher. I'm the Manager of Communications. It's a pleasure to come before you to provide an overview of our media impressions from July through October. I'm getting over a cold, so I'm going to keep the mask on since this is a shared space. Next slide, please. In July, we issued 5 press releases, one inviting the media to the Grant Street Tunnel transformation ribbon cutting that you see here. It was a great event. The weather was great, and it was the first time that we'd all seen each other in about a year, so we had a great time. Great event there. Next slide. The Peachtree Road Race was also back in July. It was spread out over 2 days, and the runners couldn't gather in Piedmont Park like they had in the past, so we didn't have any use for our popular bus shuttles, but it was still a very successful event. There were 333 news stories in July in which MARTA was mentioned. The Grant Street Tunnel transformation received the most coverage. 9% of our stories registered as positive in tone. Well, our service for the road race is a good example of that. We held public meetings to discuss the Campbellton Corridor project, and coverage of those meetings was among the 69% of news stories that were considered neutral in July. We did have a fatal incident between Lindbergh and Arts Center, and a man was killed at 5 Points in July. That led to the larger amount of negative news coverage at 22%. And the advertising value equivalent for the month was $5 million. Next slide, please. Pardon me. We sent out 6 press releases in August, one of which was inviting the media to join us at 5 Points to view the Street to Home collection. These are portraits of some of the unsheltered individuals who ride our system. Next slide. MARTA's service plan for the upcoming Labor Day holiday weekend was among the 363 news stories in August, with the federal infrastructure bill and its proposed funding for transit receiving the most news coverage for us. The unveiling of the Street to Home portraits that you saw earlier was covered by several media outlets and is a great example of the 9% of positive news stories that were covered in August. The board voted to deposit a portion of COVID relief money into DBE banks, and that was part of the 80% of the neutral news coverage we saw. And you may remember I sent you video of a bus accident where a car had ran a red light and then the bus T-boned it and pushed it down the street for a ways. Well, that video went viral. People can't help themselves. They want to share that video, and it accounted for the 11% of negative news coverage this month in August, even though MARTA was not at fault in that accident. All of these stories combined to give us an advertising value equivalent in August of $9 million. Next slide, please. September was very busy. We sent out 12 press releases, about 3 a week, and the one that got the most traction was the one that showed our exterior graphic design choices for our new rail cars. Next slide. The unveiling of a mural and graphic display celebrating Dr. Hamilton E. Holmes got a lot of great news coverage. MARTA was mentioned a lot in September, 1,200 times, with the railcar exterior designs receiving the most coverage. We partnered with DeKalb County on their COVID-19 vaccination campaign, Get Vaxxed DeKalb, and that was part of the 8% of positive news coverage for the month. 89% of the month's news stories were neutral, including announcing our own COVID vaccination policy. There was a bus accident in East Point that accounted for the small amount of negative news coverage, about 3%. And September had a big advertising value equivalent of $11 million. Next slide. October, we sent out 5 press releases. One of the highlights was a new program. We're going to be donating bicycles that are abandoned on our properties to organizations that help out people in need. Next slide. Get Vaxxed DeKalb continued to get a lot of great coverage. You can see Mr. Parker here, CEO Thurmond, and others in front of the very popular Get Vaxxed bus. Everybody wants that bus at their events. The announcement of Liz's retirement and the hiring of our new chief legal counsel and promotion of Jonathan Hunt received the most news coverage in October and was part of the 546 news stories. The bicycle program I mentioned and our other Biketober efforts made up the 6% of positive news coverage. The Summerhill BRT project continues to advance and is an example of the neutral news coverage we received in October. And there was a small amount of negative news coverage in October, all of it from the arrest of a former bus operator who was charged with a crime while working as a school bus driver for APS. October had an advertising value equivalent of $8.5 million. Next slide. And Parking Day was back this year after COVID. You may remember this is a worldwide event where parking spaces are transformed to draw attention to the need for more public spaces. So we took this as an opportunity to highlight our public programs such as Station Soccer, Fresh MARTA Markets, and Artbound. And it got a lot of great positive news coverage, which is what we love. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Members? Ms. Salam.
Yes. Stephanie, would you just briefly recap the DBE banks issue that you talked about?
Yeah, the news story that we did, hang on, let me remember which month it was in.
I think it's August.
Yeah, August, when you all voted to deposit a portion of our COVID relief money into DBE banks. That got a lot of great coverage. Remember, yeah, Chairman Pitts was here that day.
I remember. Yes, I remember the vote. I'm just wondering if it meant they had actually made deposits with these banks, selected banks. Nothing else has happened yet?
I don't think so, no. I don't
Okay.
think the actual deposits have been made yet, but
Okay.
it did get a lot of great news coverage that day, especially because, yeah, thanks, Colleen, because Chairman Pitts was here, so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody have anything else? I will just say that I look forward as we go through the process of figuring out how we're going to spend our investment from the federal infrastructure bill, the opportunities for coverage that'll be, and more opportunities for us to transform how Atlanta lives, works, and plays. Building on more MARTA, building on the investment that Clayton County made, hopefully the investment that the rest of Fulton County and DeKalb County may make someday. So in any event, is there any other business to come before the committee at this time? If not, we stand adjourned. Thank you.
committee to order, so if everyone can please sign in. Let's see, is that it? Okay. The first item on the agenda is approval of the July 22nd, 2021 Audit Committee meeting minutes. Can I have an approval? Second? So Mr. Pond approves and Mr. Floyd seconds. Can we please call the vote? The minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda is the MARTA Annual External Financial Audit for fiscal year 2021. And Brad Shell is going to do that. And I may not have pronounced your name correctly. I apologize if I didn't.
No, Brad Shelley.
Shelley? Okay.
Yes. But don't feel bad, no one gets it right.
Okay, thank you.
And I have Catherine Rushing, a manager, here with me as well. So.
Okay, welcome.
All right. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So thank you for allowing us to go through the presentation today. Again, my name is Brad Shelley. I'm a partner at Crow and have worked with MARTA for a number of years now. And what you have here on this slide is a little bit of background on kind of the process that we go through, and I'd like to include this information just as background. You may recall from a few months ago during the planning stages, we talked about a lot of these things, and really everything that we do, all the testing procedures that that go into it, and really your role as well, all builds around the concept of compliance and making sure that that you're in compliance with all the rules and regulations, whether those are government accounting standards or whether it's federal expenditures. And that's our role, is to ensure that that you are in compliance, and if there are issues that we bring those up to you. So number of different things that we look at there from a risk standpoint. The audit committee's role in that, we look at internal controls, both at an account level and entity level. We look at your financial reporting, monthly, annual processes, and then make determinations on risks there and create our audit steps based on those risks. The new accounting standards that we have for this year is GASB 84, the fiduciary activities, and there was an impact that you'll see if you've looked through the financial statements and read through those. You'll see a new section in there, fiduciary financial statements. So immediately after your basic financial statements, your, I'll call it balance sheet and income statement, you'll see the fiduciary fund statements that include the activities of the pension plan and the OPEB plan. So that is common that with the implementation of GASB 84, really the goal of that, I think, was to make that a more consistent presentation. Historically, some entities were including that as including their pension and OPEB activities as a fiduciary activity. Others were not, and so this really tries to make that a more consistent practice. That's really the only new accounting standard, and I should say from that doesn't impact the what I'll call the MARTA basic financial statements. That doesn't change the income, expenses, assets, anything of MARTA. That just takes those pension and OPEB plans, that some of which were already separately audited, the pension plans were already separately audited, and puts those in within the MARTA package as a fiduciary activity. Next slide, please. So from an audit approach, really pretty similar overall this year. Again, we do assess risk each year, and if there are new risks that are identified, we make sure that we are performing procedures to account for those risks. But in general, the plan is pretty similar. We performed interim field work in May, and we did year-end field work in mid-August through really end of September, working through a few open items. Within that includes all the substantive testing that we do on the financial statements, also includes our single audit testing, which is related to the federal grants. And then the last piece of that is the NTD testing, which is the National Transit Database, agreed upon procedures that are required, and all of that testing was completed in September, which really leads us to now, which is the reporting stage and reviewing financial statements, and then preparing those financial statements to be reviewed and presented to the audit committee. And I can say that we are ready to finalize today once we complete this the meeting. If the audit committee doesn't have any changes, we'll be ready to finalize those. Next slide, please.
So one thing that was a little different this year due to COVID was that we had to perform the majority of our procedures remotely. So this is similar to last year. This was implemented after COVID hit in early 2020. The process overall went very well. It was very efficient. We were able to receive the most of the audit documentation electronically and perform procedures remotely without having to come into the offices and maintain the social distancing requirements. Next slide. So our audit deliverables are listed here on this slide. It'll be very similar to what you've seen in the past. Over the financial statements, we'll have our audit report, and as Brad mentioned, we will have a clean opinion this year. No findings were noted during the course of our audit procedures, so there's nothing to note there, which is obviously very exciting. We'll also have the management letter and the SAS 114 letter. In relation to the single audit, we'll also have our required auditor reports over the single audit. In addition, our opinion over the CFA in relation to the basic financial statements. And as Brad mentioned, we did do those procedures over the NTD submission, so we will have an agreed upon procedures report for that. And lastly, we will be submitting the data collection form to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and we will be certifying that upon the release of the audit reports. Next slide.
So now I wanted to walk through just a few of the financial highlights from the prior year and the current year. So you can see just at a very high level some of the changes here. And really this is meant to give you just that viewpoint, a quick snapshot of the financial position. So you can see here assets and deferred outflows, pretty consistent, a slight uptick in the assets and deferred outflows, a slight decrease in the liabilities and deferred inflows. And as a result, you see an increase in the net position that's labeled here. Next slide. A deferred inflow and deferred outflow is mostly, for you all, is mostly around the pension and OPEB plans. And it's really, it's activity that hasn't actually been recognized yet as part of your net pension liability or net OPEB liability. So it's activities or transactions that will be recognized in the future, if that makes sense. It's something that came on a few years ago with GASB 68 and GASB 75 when the net pension and net OPEB liabilities came on. As a part of that, there were these deferred inflows and outflows. The most easiest to understand example, I guess I would say, is for contributions that are made after the measurement period. So if the measurement period for your pension plan is 1 year previous, any contributions made to that plan after the fact don't get recognized in the liability until the next year, and so that sets out there as a deferred outflow. So it's kind of grouped similarly with assets and liabilities, but it's not technically an asset or liability.
Mrs. Chair, I have a question. Yeah, so on the pension fund, the liabilities and the funding of it, I mean, is that clearly shown that it may not be sufficient to cover pension expenses? Or, and is that what this GASB does here? Is that what that does, kind of isolates the pension information, and we just kind of have a clear picture of what it looks like and where it stands?
Yeah, yeah, that's it. So if you're looking at the net pension liability, which is about 67 million this year, the net OPEB liability was about 112 million this year. What that represents is really the projected unfunded portion of that. Now that changes year to year based on estimates and actuarial valuations, but yeah, that's what that represents.
That's what I wanted to see. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Madam Chair? Refresh my memory on the grants portion. We have these FTA grants, and internal staff goes through that to be sure that we're doing all of the right things for reimbursement. How deep do you get involved in that, reviewing that process?
Yeah, we do look at that. That is part of what we refer to as the single audit. That in the single audit, we are looking at the federal expenditures, and in this case, the Federal Transit Cluster is the grants that we tested as a major program. Included in that Federal Transit Cluster is all of the additional federal funds that you received this year, right? So everything that came through CARES, those dollars are part of that, and those are all subject to our testing. So we do sampling of expenditures to check for, make sure that they're allowable costs, make sure that you're complying with all the rules and regulations around those.
Right. Second question I have, and I recall this may not be in your scope, but we have different buckets of money where the sales tax comes in.
Yeah.
Do you audit that to any extent? In other words, Clayton has a special pot of money, More Atlanta has a special pot of money. To what extent do you look at that?
We don't audit necessarily all of the details or the ins and outs of those. To the extent that they are considered restricted funds, we do look at those, but we're not testing a sample necessarily of those expenditures or inflows and outflows.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. On this slide, you can see just, again, a snapshot really of the previous year's activities. And so what you'll see is not really surprising. Operating revenues decreased significantly as fare revenue. That really represents almost all of the fare revenue. So you saw the fare revenue decrease. Expenses stayed pretty constant as you tried to maintain service levels. And then non-operating revenues increased significantly. And that is primarily due to two factors. One is the federal grant funding that you received, obviously, and then sales and use tax actually increased this year as well, which I know was a sign given where we were at 18 months ago and not knowing exactly how that would all play out. We've seen that increase pretty much across the board, so that's a positive as well. Capital grants pretty consistent, and then overall your change in net position, or really your net income, was a positive this year of about 140 million. Next slide, please. So then this slide is really just covering a number of other required communications. The majority of these, if we had issues, we would have already communicated, at least with the chair, if not with the entire committee. As I think we mentioned earlier, our responsibility as auditors is to provide an opinion on the financial statements, and we did provide an unqualified opinion. There were no new significant accounting policies or statements that were required outside of GASB 84 and the implementation of that GASB. No real changes in management's judgments or accounting estimates. I did mention the one estimate example of there's several estimates that go into the calculation of the net OPEB and net pension liabilities. Those have stayed relatively consistent and are reasonable. No significant judgments or changes there, and really the next one, the corrected, uncorrected misstatements, that's always a focal point, and there were none of those this year. So pleased to report no audit adjustments and no waived audit adjustments either. So very positive outcome there. Management recommendations, another item here. So this is where we would report any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal control. And again, we did not have any of those this year, so very clean audit this year. No other communications to report. Next slide, please. We always like to conclude with providing a little bit of insight on looking forward and what to expect as we move into future years. There's always new GASBs being issued, and so there's always a new issue to tackle, and next year is no different, and maybe the most challenging one in a while with GASB 87 and the lease implementation. I know in talking with your accounting team, they have been working on this for quite a while to prepare for it, and really to boil it down without getting too technical, what it's going to do is it's going to take pretty much all leases that you have, whether that is as a lessee or a lessor, and put those on similar to a capital lease. So you'll have essentially an asset and a liability related to that, versus in the past, most of your leases have been more operating in nature, and so you just record the expense as it's happening. This will actually put an asset and a liability. There may be some deferred inflows and outflows as well, depending on the nature of the transaction, but generally speaking, it's going to have some assets and liabilities. I don't expect there to be a significant net impact as far as income or expense, but there is a significant amount of work that'll be involved in that. I know you all are trying to procure, I think, some software to help with tracking all of the leases, because that is going to be the most significant challenge, is identifying all the leases and everything that is a potential lease, and then being able to make sure that all those transactions are accounted for appropriately. So we have been working alongside with accounting to provide some guidance along the way on this, but I know they're still working through that process, and that'll be a challenge for them for this year. The other ones on here are a little less significant, I would say, although GASB 89 will also impact your organization. That's going to change how interest on any kind of debt-financed construction is recorded. So previously you could capitalize that interest that is being incurred prior to the completion of construction. That'll now be expensed. GASB 98 is really just a naming change, providing that it will now be called the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report instead of the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and that related to the acronym that was previously used in some insensitive issues with that acronym. And then GASB 96 is a couple years out, but that may have some impact as well as we look at subscription-based technology agreements and how those are recorded. So I think that's it. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just again, wanted to thank you all for allowing us to present the financial results and reports, and again, just commend the MARTA finance and accounting team in the job that they have done. I know just in talking with them, I've seen a lot of improvements and efficiencies made through the years as we've worked with them, and I think that has helped, not only I think from their side, but I can speak from our side, has helped us to have a more effective and efficient audit process and to be able to work through things. So thank you all, and if you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer those now.
Mr. Dupson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You talked a lot about the GASB 84 and the pension itself. How do you actually interact with the pension staff or committee, throughout the year? How is the information relayed or conveyed to you?
So we don't have interaction with the pension committee. We do, for the pension side of things, we rely on the pension audited financial statements for the testing. So we acquire those. Those are already being tested and audited, so we don't need to audit those again. On the OPEB side of things, there we have to do the testing ourselves. But as far as interaction directly with the committees, we don't typically have interaction with them.
Yeah, and pension staff as well, or the staff itself?
Yeah, we're working with the staff to get the information that we need. So whether it's looking at statements or whether it's getting the actuarial valuations, yeah, we are working with them to get that information.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any additional questions? Mr. Pond?
Initially, you started off saying there were no significant findings, which is a true compliment to Emil and his staff. My question is, prior years, or on the prior year, were there any significant findings? And if there were, do you follow up with that in this current year to be sure they were
Yes.
addressed?
Yeah, so we did have one finding last year, and we did follow up on that, and there were no concerns. We didn't find any issues related to that bank account was being reconciled properly, and so that was fully resolved. To the second part, yeah, we always follow up on those, so we're required to follow up on those and ensure that those have been addressed, and if they are not addressed, then they'll be reported again as a finding.
Any additional questions? Mr. Floyd?
Quick question about the leases. Is that any kind of lease, or is it, I mean, because we lease property to
Yep.
people, and we lease, you know, I'm sure we lease some vehicles and all that kind of stuff. What,
Yes. So
is
it
it any
is.
kind of lease then?
It is really any kind of lease that you can think of, and then probably things that you haven't thought of, and that's what makes it complex. Because what the accounting standards require is for you to look at really any contract and determine even if there is a lease component within there. So it could be a contract that maybe has, you know, an example that is frequently used is with IT services. So there might be a lease component where you're actually leasing some type of software, or another example is like a phone system. So you might be leasing actual equipment, but you might also be getting services along with that. And the services might not qualify as a lease. So if they're providing, you know, administrative support or technical assistance or those types of things, that probably wouldn't qualify as a lease. But the equipment that you're leasing within there would qualify as a lease, and you would be required to kind of carve that out and record that as a lease.
Would
So
whoever's leasing that to us be required to provide that information, or do we
Yes.
determine that?
Yes, so that is part of the complexity is really you kind of start at a high level, and it's obtaining all of the contracts, right, that MARTA has, reviewing those contracts to see, is there anything that looks like maybe there's a lease in here, or, you know, some are more clear, right? So if you're leasing a property or some type of equipment, those are pretty clear, but it's getting all the agreements, identifying whether there's any lease components within there, and then to the extent that you need more information, yes, you may be having to work directly with whoever the lessee or lessor is, depending on the situation, to get more information about that.
So I think a good example that we'll have to figure out is we lease tires, but along with that lease of tires, we get a service where they are maintaining that leased equipment. So we've got to figure out how much of that contract is for the
Yes.
lease and how much of that contract is for the services. And we haven't necessarily gone through a procurement process that articulates exactly what the allocation of those two is.
Right. So that becomes one part of the complication. The tire lease in particular, there is some guidance around that, because depending on how the lease is structured, it may or may not qualify, because it's one of those that kind of has some wear and use on it, and if you're paying based on that wear and use, then it may not qualify as a lease. So there's a lot of particulars in there that go into it, and that's that's what really makes it complicated, right? Is there's a lot of different types of leases, and then how they're all set up are differently. At first blush, it may seem like it could be pretty easy until you really dig in and realize that most of the lease contracts aren't a real straightforward, here's the payments that you make over.
It appears to me it could have an impact on our procurement policy about how we advertise things and the information we ask for on a bid. Rather, I mean, it would seem to me that if, 'cause this sounds like a nightmare to me, okay? But it would be, if we're gonna buy something, even though we may think it is just a normal procurement, there may be an aspect in there, if I'm listening, if I'm hearing this right, that we may need, at the time we get the prices, we may need for them to say, you need to separate out what's the lease based on these facts
Yeah,
and what's not.
Yeah, creating a procurement system that tracks all that, so it's just this, allocation of and tracking of something
No,
that we have is what we'll need
yes,
to do.
that'll be a key thing, is being able to track all of that moving forward. To your point about the different aspects of the lease, there are some, I would call them expedients that you can apply to those. So, most of your leases are not going to have an interest rate stated in there. That doesn't mean you have to go to the lessee or lessor and find out what that interest rate is. You can apply, your own borrowing rate as a practical expedient. So there are some things in there that it would be nice if all that information was in a lease agreement, but it's probably not going to be. And a lot of that, I'm not sure you're going to get people to put into the lease agreements moving forward. Maybe. We'll see as everything changes, but.
My suspect is a lot of these people who do these leases don't have any idea what that.
Yeah,
figure might
I
be.
would agree, because this is a lot of what's being included in here hasn't been a part of the accounting before. So it was more straightforward in the past. Now it's a lot less straightforward.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any additional questions?
Yeah, I have a question. So, and this concerning the gas 89 that you're working with. So, can you help me understand, is this just a recategorizing of something that you already do, or is it something in addition that you're trying to capture in terms of the interest costs incurred?
So GASB 89 will be a change in how it's accounted for.
All right.
So currently, if you have interest that is incurred during a construction period, that would be potentially capitalized as part of the overall cost of the asset. Right. What this GASB is going to do is change that, so you will expense that. So it ends up in the same place, right? So eventually, it all boils down to timing. So now you'll be incurring that expense sooner versus under the previous methodology. When you roll it into the capital asset, it eventually gets expensed through depreciation expense, but not until future years. So this really just kind of accelerates the timing of recognizing that expense.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Roberta, you have another question?
Just a quick one, just out of curiosity. How long has Crow been with MARTA?
This is our 4th year, I believe.
Thank you.
I had to think for a second.
Ms. Scott?
Excuse me, you caught me in the middle of. What does the implementation of 6/30/23 for the GASB 96 look like?
Well, so that one is the 6/20 or 6/30/23 means in 2 years we'll implement that. That is going to be looking around, like I said, the subscription-based agreements. I don't know to the extent how much that'll impact MARTA. We haven't really done a deep dive into that yet to see how many of those you have. I suspect we may get a better handle on that as we work through GASB 87 and you're going through a lot of the agreements and leases and contracts. we may get a better handle on how many, if any, of those you have. But I don't know what kind of impact it'll have on MARTA yet. I don't suspect it'll be nearly as significant as what we're talking about with GASB 87.
But
And again, that is more of a timing of, is it going to be expensed versus is it going to be treated as an asset and then expensed over time?
So, because it says the implementation of 2023, are we looking at preparing for that and what it will look like in 2023?
I can't speak for management, but I know they're aware of it. I don't know how far along in the process they are at looking at that. I know their immediate concern is GASB 87, but I know we've at least mentioned this GASB.
Okay.
I believe at this point, we're not sure, and they're looking into it, but no one has come up with exactly what the plan will look like.
Right, I understand, and I just know in this world, 2023 for new implementation
Raj, do
is
you want to? Yeah.
right around the corner.
Good morning. The lease accounting is not something new. This has been in the private sector for, gosh, at least 25 years. That's how long I've been in the business. They used to call it, in the private sector, it's called FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board. Here it's GASB. And the lease accounting that mentioned kind of follows the FASB guideline, what's called the FAS 13, how to capitalize, how to record that, as opposed to just expensing that. So I've already had some preliminary conversations with my accounting group, and I think, we are in a good position to implement this by 2023. I mean, it's change in accounting, but however, not something unique to us, not something that may be unique to the public sector, but this has been around in the private sector for a long time, and I've been in both private and public, so I think we do have a pretty good handle on that.
What about the subscription-based technology agreements? I think you're talking about the leasing, which is the 2022, and that.
Yeah, even on that, for example, yes, leases typically do not stipulate an interest rate, for example. So we do what's called an implicit interest rate. You can discount that using a certain acceptable discount. That's one way of doing. And the subscription-based, the key there is to separate out services from the actual asset lease, if you will. One concrete or good example I can give on that is rail cars. We don't do that. Most transits do not do that. But however, in the private sector, rail cars are leased, and also comes with a service contract. So the rail car lease itself is capitalized. In other words, you book an asset on the balance sheet, you depreciate that. Their tax is a big issue, which we don't have to contend with. And the service contract, or what we pay to maintain that, is expensed. So that's kind of the theory behind it. I do believe as I said, I've had some discussions with our accounting group, and I think, I'm reasonably confident we can implement that in the timeline required.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any additional questions? We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
The next item on our agenda, Emil is going to give us an internal audit activity briefing.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Parker, members of the Board of Directors of MARTA, thank you for the opportunity to give you a brief overview of the internal audit activities for the fiscal first quarter of FY22 from July 1st to September 30th. Next slide, please. Starting with the operational audit group, during Q1, we finished 2 audits. One was for bus maintenance, and the other one is on the alertness assurance policy compliance. The bus maintenance audit identified one significant finding related to the predictive maintenance inspection process. We noted, based on data analytics, quite a few exceptions there, and we've discussed those with management, and they have provided a corrective action plan with a due date of February 1st of 2022. The alertness assurance policy compliance audit was pretty clean. No significant findings, two moderate findings, more of best practices recommendations there. Again, we've discussed those with management, and they were receptive to those as well. The third audit that we're wrapping up as we speak is the contingencies review process and the reporting process as well. So we'll report those at the next audit committee meeting. Next slide, please. From previous audits, what's left out is really very few findings. Management's been working very actively in terms of closing significant findings over the past 12 months, really. The first one, I want to point out the enhancement and automation of the external training request form through Oracle. I just got confirmation through some actual testing that this action item has been completed and closed, so it will drop off from this slide. It's done, and actually I personally tested it, so I can say that it works. The next one is related to the capital improvement program follow-up. You see 10 different findings. A lot of them are related to various different policies and procedures. Now, what I do want to say is that a lot of progress has been made. And Dorinda McCombs from the capital programs team sent us a number of draft procedures. But as we all know, in a race, you got to finish and cross the finish line. So even though a lot of progress has been made, we just need to continue to push to get these things through the finish line, those policies and procedures adopted, signed off, and moved into production. So I had to kind of highlight it as a past due, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that these things have not been worked on. So hopefully by the time the next audit committee comes in, we'll be able to report those as closed, but we're auditors. We'll have to verify, we have to retest, we have to make sure. So we'll report again the next audit committee meeting with the actual progress on those. Next slide, please. Moving over to the Information Technology Audit Group for the Q1 of FY22. We kicked off, or we started, two very important audits. The first one is a password management audit. The reason we had that on the audit plan is password cracking is one of the most common vectors where companies get penetrated and get ransomware afterwards. So it's very important for us to make sure that our password management controls are really, really robust. We're focusing on our Windows environment, all of our laptops, computers, and etc., and user devices, and we're also focusing on Oracle, because Oracle is our IT crown jewel, if you will. We do a lot of things on Oracle. So we're working through that audit. The cybersecurity insurance review audit is really focusing on, let me step back. When we get a cybersecurity insurance policy, we have to fill a long questionnaire related to our cybersecurity controls. And we have to answer yes here, no here, yes here, no here. We took that questionnaire from Donna's team and we sampled certain elements of it. We can't go through the whole thing, but we sampled what we think are the highest risk items from that questionnaire. We wanted to make sure that the information was accurate, complete, and that we could also provide documentation if needed that substantiates the answer. So we're going through that process as we speak. Again, we're meeting with Dean Mallis, who sits there on a weekly basis to discuss progress, to discuss potential issues and things of that nature. So very collaborative process with Dean and with Donna Jennings' group. I really have to say, thank you to them for being transparent, because I've worked in other organizations in the past where the level of collaboration and transparency is a lot lower. So I do have to give credit to those two teams for being transparent and collaborative in this effort. Lastly, the patch management audit was completed during the quarter. What we refer to as we talk about patch management is the implementation and installation of security updates on various different pieces of software and hardware, right? We get those security updates from Microsoft, from Cisco, from Oracle, from a number of other vendors on all of our information technology assets. There are 3 significant findings which we have discussed with management, and we will diligently follow up on the remediation of those significant findings. Next slide, please. From previous audits, I will start with our train control systems and SCADA. cybersecurity audit. I need to disclose that we changed the due date of those remaining 4 significant findings to future dates because of some delays in transitioning the system from Alstom to MARTA. In discussions with management, George, and Dean, I felt comfortable that it was justified to push out the due dates. We remain very involved on staying on top of the remediation. I do have to say that in any industrial control system environment, and our train control system and SCADA are one form of industrial control system. Other forms could be a nuclear power plant, a water facility. Those are all industrial control system environments. Those are very complex and difficult to manage from a cybersecurity perspective because they combine your regular cybersecurity with your Windows machines with a lot of different pieces of hardware that are in the environment. And the level of complexity that's required to secure it, but also to audit it, is much, much higher. So we'll stay on top of this thing until it gets fixed. We have invested in capabilities from an internal audit perspective to make sure we know what we're talking about. But we rescheduled the due dates. And then one of the issues that continues to be worked on is the centralized management of various different devices and software pieces on the MARTA network on the next audit. Let me continue to the next slide, please. The contract audit group has been extremely busy with a lot of reviews. They completed 36 audits in 1 quarter, identified potential savings of $195,000. We remain pretty busy. We had 20 audits in the pipeline, but as you know, these audits come at a high level or a high rate right now, and we crack them up as quickly as we possibly can. So we'll continue to be a very productive organization as it relates to contract audits. Finally, next slide. The fraud, waste, and abuse summary. We received 9 calls on the hotline between July 1st and September 30th. We referred those to various different operations. In the first 2 cases, we will follow up on their own review of stealing time in the case of the bus operations, and also some allegation of kind of double billing with the contracts and procurement. 2 of the calls related to FMLA, we referred them to HR. They did their own investigation, and we reviewed that investigation with them, and they concluded that it was an unsubstantiated allegation. 2 calls were forwarded to customer service. We don't follow up on customer service related calls. And then 1 call was related to changing the location of a bus stop. We referred those to the planning department. Again, we don't follow up on those calls either. Madam Chair, next slide. This concludes my briefing for the Q1 fiscal 22 activities.
Thank you. Do we have questions for Emil? Mr. Pond?
Going back to the operations audit group, the capital improvements category, there were 10 there.
Mm-hmm.
Did a lot of those things come out of the audit from KPMG, from the MARTA committee, or were they generated internally?
No, these are generated internally. Had nothing to do with KPMG. KPMG had a copy of the audit of all of our audits, but this was really coming out of a periodic review that we do of the capital improvement program. We did one last year, so this was all internally generated.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned the password management audit.
Yes.
How do you manage that? I mean, passwords change, and are these individual passwords that you manage, and you test to see if they're using something that's consistent, or is it system generated passwords?
So I can tell you how we audit that,
Yes.
how we manage it.
Kirk, you could probably help answer this question.
The first part is how we audit it. Is we audit the process, and there's standards that go with the process. Standards coming from NIST. the National Institute of Standards and Technology,
Right.
and we're subscribing to those. So we audit against those standards, and we also audit against, MARTA has its own policy that has prescriptive requirements in the policy. So we audit to see if the policy is being enforced.
Okay.
Now, how we manage individual passwords, I'll leave this to Kirk.
Yes, thank you very much. I don't know if that's the nature of your question. How do we manage it? It depends on the type of password.
Okay.
Individuals, like on desktops, we have so many characters, have to be changed every so often, that sort of thing. So the system manages that. Where it gets more complicated is when you're looking at system passwords that only a handful of administrators have access to. Those are stored in encrypted software tools that allow us to do that. They're changed on a frequency. We have policies around who can access them, those sorts of things.
Okay, so those are system-generated numbers that are changed, not by somebody that's saying that I want to use a number that I'm creating.
So some
both?
systems, keep in mind every different system, some allow you to create automated passwords, some you type it in. Each system has different tools available to that. For the more critical system administrator passwords, the kind of the keys to the kingdom, we make sure that very few people have access to them, only people that are authorized and required, that those are changed at the frequency necessary for the individual systems, and that they're stored securely.
Okay.
Kirk, could you just, he didn't ask the question, but I think it's a relevant issue where we are in the implementation of two-factor authoring, you know?
Yes, sir, two-factor authorization. So I don't know exactly when the quest began, but two-factor authentication, for those people that are not familiar with it, is where you type in your password based on who you are, and then you get some sort of secondary challenge. It could be a text, it could be a type in a changing code. You probably run into them with your banks typically. Most financial institutions at this point require them. We have been working through MARTA to make sure that that is turned on, so that remote access to most of our cloud-based systems require two-factor authentication. That being said, we have to go system by system to make sure that that's true, because there's no universal turn it on and now everything just works. But we've been making sure that we're securing Oracle, the crown jewels, as Mr. Emile calls it, and our Microsoft access to email, files, that sort of thing. With a primary focus on making sure that two-factor authentication is required whenever you're outside of MARTA. When you're inside of MARTA, you're in a secure location on a secured network. But we continue to work through in terms of prioritization for those systems.
Thank you. That's good to know the two sources of authentication. It's important because we're all experiencing that now, and that's why I wanted to know how we was handling managing that. That's good. All right, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Jeff.
Kirk, refresh my memory. Every day we have gazillions of pieces of data. We have that backed up. Refresh my memory. We back that up outside of your internal.
So
Backups is what I'm asking.
yes, sir. We have a secured backup methodology where and again, it goes system by system, right? So our email is in the cloud. We don't bring that to MARTA to back it up. It's working with Microsoft. We back that up. But the data that we generate here that's located here, in some systems, we send it to the cloud for redundancy and backup. In other cases, we store it on our, it's called Commvault, the system that we use. It has a gap solution so that even if something gets backed up, bad people can't come in and modify that. So it's a lockdown, secured backup system.
Any other questions? We have one other matter, the audit documents for information only. Nope, that's just for your information. That's not anything else that we have to do. Are there any other matters that need to come before the audit committee? I just want to say thank you. There's a lot of work that goes into this, both from Emile's team as well as we just heard from the IT and also from cybersecurity. I appreciate everything everyone's doing to try to keep us safe out there. Thank you. We're adjourned. Turn it on at Dean.